Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's middle game video I'm going to talk about isolated pawns, how to play with them and how to play against them. I'm going to explain the main ideas behind positions with isolated pawns for both sides, for the player who has the weak isolated pawn and the player who is playing against it. The first position I've set up is a random position just to show you some main features of the positions with an isolated pawn, and as an example I've used an isolated queen's pawn, because this is one position and one pawn when isolated which gives most chances to the side who has it. Now in general, isolated pawns are a weakness. They are a static structural weakness which can be exploited by the opposite side, and basically whoever has the isolated pawn doesn't want to trade the pieces off. This is the first principle you should remember and one which you should stick to. Once you have an isolated pawn, that means that any endgame is going to be worse for you, meaning that if all the pieces are off the board, like in this position, then it's going to be easier for black to round up your d4 pawn in this case than it's going to be for you to round up the f7 or the g7 pawn. So this is one thing white has to keep in mind. If you have an isolated pawn, you don't trade off pieces, you don't enter the endgame. The only thing you get for an isolated pawn, if you manage to get it, is piece activity. And this is why the isolated queen's pawn is the most thematic pawn when isolated, and the only one which is considered theoretically sound to have, and people actually enter isolated queen's pawn positions voluntarily. Of course, there are exceptions, and sometimes one other pawn on any other file could be active enough and give white enough activity or black enough activity, but in general the isolated queen's pawn is thought to give the most active position to the side which accepts the static weakness. Now what does white get in return? So obviously white has a static weakness which black is going to play against. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how to play against an isolated pawn. Aaron Nimzovich said that pawns should be, especially passed pawns but isolated pawns as well, should be blockaded and fixed. Whenever your opponent has a static weakness, you want to make sure that it can't move and dissolve itself and not be a weakness anymore. So obviously white would want to push his pawn and trade it off for this pawn. In this case, if you trade off these two pawns, the position is structurally equal and white doesn't have a weakness. This is why black is going to play against this pawn, firstly by blockading it. One move you should consider here is c6, simply to prevent the move d5, and the main idea to stop isolated pawns from moving is to blockade them. The main blockading piece is a knight. So if you can get, for example, one knight to f6 and the other knight into d5, that would mean that the pawn can't move, it can't ever move. And then the idea is once you have blockaded the pawn, then you want to attack it after that. You don't want to attack the pawn which can move, because then often tactically the pawn can dissolve itself and the structure can change. So this is what black is playing for. Black is playing for blockading and attacking the pawn. White, on the other hand, in isolated queen's pawn positions, has some trumps. The first thing is that the E file or the C file are always either semi-open or open, because white doesn't have pawns, so in either case they are semi-open. That means that the rooks and the queen have active files, as opposed to black's position where his rooks and his queen don't have as much space. The second thing is, with the absence of the E4 pawn or E3 pawn and C4 pawn or C3 pawn, a lot of diagonals are open towards the black king. This means that white has more activity for his bishops too. The third thing is that white gets to use the squares c5 and especially e5 as outposts for his knights. This is why you are often going to see the move b6 being played, or even f6, which weaken the position significantly. Now if you imagine the white bishop on d3 staring at the h7 pawn, the white knight on e5 staring at f7, g6, d7 and the whole position, and the queen coming from d1 to h5, then you can see that white did manage to get enough activity for the isolated pawn. Once again, if white exchanges off his attacking pieces and is left with the weakness, then none of that really works. Now, the isolated pawn doesn't have to be an isolated queen's pawn, and in general, when you don't have an isolated queen's pawn and pieces on the board to attack with, then it's considered to be only a weakness, and you can't really get any dynamic play. Of course, once again, there are exceptions, but rarely it happens that your isolated pawn is a strength rather than a weakness. The same principle applies for black. If this pawn weren't on the queen's file, let's say the pawn was here, once again you want to blockade it, round it up, attack it afterwards. You don't need to hurry with taking the isolated pawns, you just need to make sure they can't move and that they remain a permanent weakness the defending player is going to have to look after. The one thing I would like to emphasize for the player who is playing against the isolated pawn, you have two trumps. The first one is, since there are no pawns on the adjacent files, the square in front of the pawn is always weak. And the square in front of the pawn is always an outpost. Whichever piece you manage to get, in this case to d5, that's an outpost from which the piece can't be dislodged. This is your major strength in isolated pawn positions. The second one is that the isolated pawn ties down a piece to the defense. It's either a major or a minor piece, usually it's a rook or a knight. But whichever piece is defending, it's defending the pawn, and if white has a rook on d1 defending d4, then you obviously have a rook up in the game at the moment, and if white decides to give up the pawn, the rook is going to be active. So your two main advantages are the weak square in front of the isolated pawn, which cannot be contested by other pawns, and the fact that in order to defend the pawn, the defender is going to have to use a piece. The pawn can't be defended by another pawn. We are going to look at 5 examples. We are going to look at isolated queen's pawn positions in which white got enough activity and won the game by checkmating. We are going to look at a position in which an isolated pawn, two isolated pawns were provoked and then an overwhelming attack was created. We are going to look at a game in which Ivanchuk masterfully exploited an isolated pawn, a really textbook example, and we are going to look at a crazy 4 isolated pawns game between Carlsen and Anand. So let's go to the first example. The first example is a game between Efim Geller and Alexei Svetin, played in 81. This was Sicilian Khan. Surprisingly, the Sicilians don't result in isolated pawns too often. Most often, isolated pawns result from the Queen's Gambit, the Rimzo Indian, the French, the Caro-Kann, Tarash, and the semi-Tarash. Mostly Queen's pawn openings, but French and Caro-Kann as well. So in this position, white is already better, but the game continued. Bishop takes d4, c takes d4, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, and now you can see that white has an isolated pawn. Now what did we say white's plans were? White wants to either attack with his active pieces, or white could also go for dissolving the weakness. If white manages to push d5, as we said, then he no longer has an isolated pawn. In this position, of course, Efim Geller went on for the attack because you can see these wonderful bishops and this queen being able to come to h5, and this is what I was talking about. If you manage to get enough activity for your isolated pawn, then it really doesn't matter that you have a static structural weakness. Queen d8 was played. Queen to h5, a simple attacking move. Knight to d5, bishop to g5, it's already a tough position, knight c e7 defending, rook f to e1, bringing another piece into play, h6, and now rook a to d1, the pawn is of course pinned, the rook is hanging, so the pawn can't take the bishop, and now Efim Geller managed to get all of his pieces into play. At the same time, Alexei Svetin did manage to blockade the pawn, and this is what I was talking about. The knight is the best defender, and if you can get 2 knights reinforcing the same square, then you are fine. But unfortunately for him, the attack is too much. Queen d6 was played, and now bishop takes e7, removing one defender, knight takes e7, d5, dissolving the pawn, opening up the position using the fact that the black king is in the center. E takes d5, bishop takes d5, queen to f6, a decisive blunder, and now there is a simple tactic, Efim Geller. So bishop takes f7, if you play king to f8, rook is checkmate. If you take with the queen, then still rook check and winning the queen. So if you take with the queen, just this check is enough to win the queen, and you are going to get checkmated very soon. So this position is, after bishop takes d4, takes, an obvious example of how isolated queen's pawn positions are reached to white's advantage in this case, because white managed to trade off a pair of central pawns and pieces, a pair of minor pieces, in order to get more activity and open diagonals for his pieces. This is a textbook example which Efim Geller finished marvelously. The second one is a bit harder. This came from the semi-Tarash in the Queen's Gambit declined. Bishop to b4 was played here. This is a game between Paul Keres and Efim Geller in the 1962 Candidates playoff. After bishop to b4, in this position, Paul Keres played d5 immediately, and that's a very logical move. d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, and now he has an isolated queen's pawn, but it's already on the d file. Now in this position you can't really win the pawn because bishop h7 uncovers an attack and you win everything. So this wouldn't really be smart. Queen to e7 was played, getting out of the pin. Knight to e5, going in for an attack. Once again, you can see that by trading off central pawns and a pair of minor pieces, white is often in the queen's pawn openings able to get an isolated queen's pawn position for a lot of activity. f6, a dubious try, queen h5, g6, horrible, and now just knight takes, h takes, bishop takes, queen g7, rook to d3. White went on to win fairly easily. I just wanted to show you how trading off central material often leads to isolated queen's pawn positions where white has these two marvelous bishops, and very often the bishops are going to be the decisive material advantage white has. Okay, the next game is slightly different. This is Nakamura versus Nelson Castaneda from the 2004 US Open. And now Nakamura created a plan to weaken Castaneda's kingside pawn structure and to create isolated pawns. He played a very active move here. Even though it might seem counterintuitive and weakening your king as well, he played the move g4. After g4, if you take with the f pawn, then simply bishop takes, your knight is pinned, f5 is coming, and white is going to bring his queen to the king side and open up the position, play rook c2, rook g2, and attack. So you have to take. You can't take. So after g4, he played g6, trying to defend, forcing Nakamura to take with the pawn, and now gf5, gf5, and now you have it. Two isolated pawns on the king side. White, of course, has also accepted one, but the f5 pawn is going to be the main weakness in the position. Conversely, white has a twice protected passed pawn on e5, so the structure is tremendously favorable for white, and white is actually winning because of his static advantages. Another thing which is provided by this weak pawn is the fact that black is really cramped in the defense. This pawn is actually restricting a lot of play black could have. It's restricting any counterplay with queen to h3, for example. The f4 pawn, which is now really hard to attack because of the f5 pawn, is restricting the knight, and this position is just better for Nakamura. And I wanted to use this example to show you how to attack a position when your opponent has an isolated pawn. Rook to f3, a fairly simple rook lift. King to h8, bishop to d3, getting all of his pieces into play. Rook f7, rook to h3. Once you are playing against static, isolated pawns, and it's really hard for your opponent to maneuver their pieces around them, you want to get as many pieces into the position because you have time. Don't start a mindless attack and just sacrifice a piece. You have time here. This bishop isn't playing, this bishop is hardly in the game, the queen is going to take several moves to get into game. The rook can get to g8 with check, okay, king h1, and now c5. Black is trying to get counterplay, but it's not enough. Queen h5, getting all of his pieces into play. Knight to d8, knight to e2. You're playing around this weakness. You don't even want to take it in this case. You're just using it. It's sort of dam between the black pieces in the defense. It's cutting off communication. So remember that if you can manage to create an isolated pawn in the attack, it can often use as a thorn which is going to tear apart your opponent's position. Nakamura went on to win this. I'm just going to go through the moves quickly. It's not a simple tactical win, of course, but you can see that he slowly builds up, brings all of his pieces into play. In this position, Nelson Castaneda resigned, and it's obvious that he has to resign. I mean, which piece? This bishop is the only piece that isn't perfect, and that could change soon. So remember that once you get these positions like this, and you see a pawn break which you could play, which is weakening your king as well, remember this pattern. If you manage to create an isolated pawn in your opponent's king side, then it's going to be really tough for him to defend. Okay, now for the first textbook example. This is Ivanchuk Miguel Illescas Cordova from 2005. And this is how you play against an isolated king's pawn, an isolated pawn, sorry. This is an example in which black, of course, has absolutely nothing for the isolated pawn. Black simply has a structural weakness. Both sides have the bishop pair, both sides have two rooks, both kings are in the center, neither side can create a menacing attack. Black simply has a static weakness which Ivanchuk is going to exploit and win the game. The first and logical move when your opponent has an isolated pawn, blockade it. So bishop to d2, trying to blockade the pawn. e6, forcing the bishop away. You always go to the most active square. If he plays f5, then okay, you're going to move further away. But you want to keep control of as many squares as possible. Bishop to c5, an active move. Bishop to c3, blockading the pawn. Stage 1 complete. You want to make sure that the pawn can't move. You're also attacking g7. Castles, e3, restricting your opponent's play. Rook f to d8, rook to d1. If he exchanges pieces, the position is favorable for him. As we said, when your opponent has an isolated pawn, you want to get into the endgame because obviously the white king can simply march up the board and win the pawn, whereas the black king can hardly win the e3 pawn or the f2 pawn or the g3 pawn. Bishop to b5, king to e2, bishop to a4, attacking the rook. Of course, you don't want to play b3, losing a pawn. So now rook takes d8, rook takes d8, rook to c1. Putting pressure on the pawn indirectly, and so it begins. f5, trying to get counterplay, chasing the bishop away from his most active square, bishop f3, king f7, getting the king into the game, and black is playing fine, black is playing the most logical moves, but this game just goes on to prove how hard it is to play with the structural weakness. King to e1, bishop e5, bishop to e2, putting another attacker on the pawn, and it's soon going to drop, a6, bishop to d2. Now the pawn is attacked twice. Can you defend it? No, and this is about it. Bishop d6, bishop takes c4, cashing out his advantage, taking the pawn, bishop e5, b3, rook a8, a4, bishop c4, rook c4. The same colored bishops. White has a 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side. White went on to win convincingly. Of course, there's nothing black can do in this position. Let's go back. Okay. The rook defended. The first move is logical. Blockade the pawn and round it up later. Ivanchuk wasn't in a hurry to play rook to c1, bishop to f3, bishop to e2. He firstly played bishop e4, keeping his bishop on the most active square. You don't want to attack the pawn as soon as possible. Just blockade it. You're going to attack it later on. The last example we are going to look at today is the game Carlsen Anand from Linares 2009. This came from a very aggressive Semislav Stolz variation and the Shirov Shabalov attack with g4, a very aggressive line. And in this position you can already see that Anand is, well, his position is messed up. He has 4 isolated pawns and 1 pair is doubled, so structurally this is very weak. And now let's see how masterfully Magnus Carlsen played against it. Bishop e6 by Anand, defending everything. Knight c7, this was the key move. Rook a to g8, and now knight takes c6. The pawn is pinned, of course, so the king has to take. And he used this opportunity to grab the bishop, which is an okay defender of the isolated pawns. Of course, rook can't take the rook, because the knight is defending, so king e6. Now rook takes g8, exchanging pieces, knight takes g8, king to e2, marching the king nearer to the weaknesses. Now the material is pretty reduced, both sides have a minor piece and a rook, but still, these weaknesses are too much in black's position and white is going to win fairly easily. Knight e7, Anand is fighting on, king to f3. The key thing, if you can do it, if there is not a lot of material on the board, especially if the queens are on the board, you want to blockade the pawns with your king, because then if any defender is removed, your king can just take and you have an extra piece in play. Rook c8, trying to activate, but there are really no infiltration squares. All the main squares are taken, there's nothing he can do with the rook. a4, trying to lock down the position on the queen side. This is a trait of great players. If you have an advantage of one side of the board, try to get an advantage on the other side as well. You will cash out on your weaknesses on the first side later on. Rook c7. Anand really doesn't have any moves. a5, locking down the queen side. h6, a waiting move, he can't do anything. h4, trying to lock down the king side as well. King f6, h5. He isn't afraid of this move, because it's going to be really hard playing a king down if you take this pawn and then the position is just losing. So knight to c8. King to f4, now preventing the king from coming into g5. Knight to d6, remaneuvering his knight but towards what end? Rook to g1, rook c8, f3, just marching his pawn slowly up the board, getting all of his pieces next to the weaknesses. You can already see the king, the bishop and the rook working together perfectly. King e6, rook g7, attacking the weakness. Rook h8, bishop c2, trying to perhaps remaneuver the bishop here. Here, bishop to b3 was played. Rook to h8. Anand really doesn't have anything to do. This game was so sad. When you have so many structural weaknesses, you really can't move any of your pieces. You are restricted to the defense. You can see that the knight has to defend the f5 pawn. The rook is going to have to defend h6, otherwise rook h7. The king has to defend all the pawns, and there is no hope for black to play any attacking move of his own. He has no plans. He just has to defend and curl up and wait to die. Rook g1. Okay, a bit of maneuvering, and Carlsen is waiting for the best opportunity to strike. He dissolved one of the weaknesses here, played e5, and now it's nearly over, exchanging the pawns over there, getting his pieces into perfect positions, and now he just wins one pawn. Soon enough he's going to win the other. If the knight moves, then the f6 pawn is dropping off. Now the knight has moved. Here the knight moved, so takes, and you can see how easily the weaknesses can drop. But the main thing to remember is that once your opponent has those weaknesses, you want to blockade them. Look at what he did. He brought his king to f4. There are no attacking pieces. Of course, if there was a queen on e7, this would be very risky, but since there are no attacking pieces which could do harm to the king, bring all of your pieces, including the king, next to the weaknesses before you try to attack one. He didn't just mindlessly attack one weakness, go for the h6 pawns. He first put all of his pieces into perfect attacking squares. Okay, just to recap on the isolated pawn positions. If you have an isolated pawn, you need to have piece activity as compensation for that, or you have to dissolve the pawn, try to exchange it. If you're playing against the isolated pawn, don't just attack it at once, blockade it, and then attack it afterwards. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked this video. Let me know what you think. Hope it helps. Once again, I would just like to thank everybody who has been supporting me, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. See you later.